And when did I get this idea for this particular rabbinic text? Because I was asked to speak about some rabbinic texts on Tisha B'Av, the day of national mourning for the Jewish people, for the Beis HaMikdash, Batei Mikdash, the holy temples, and especially during the time of the second destruction, destroyed by the powers of the Roman Empire under the Roman general Titus, who later became emperor, Yamach Shemo V'Zichro, and it describes the extensive, what we call the Agadata, this expository literature, which most people or Talmudic scholars are taught on Tisha B'Av. There are several folios, several pages of the Gemara there in Gittin, from all the way from Daf Nun Hey Amud Beis, going for several blot. Now here is a text which you might say, well, what does it have to do with a particular case of an abused child in a school or in a playground or by a family member or so forth? What I want to emphasize, the potential and the actual consequences that could happen, and a rabbinic problem that cites this text within the context of something else. Now, what is the story represented here? I say the Tisha B'Av text. So the story is there in the Masechta Gittin, Tractate Gittin, and Daf Nun Zayin Amud Beis. And the Gemara tells you about a 400 children, Yolodim v'Yolodos. They're not talking about Norim and Noros, what we say older children, but Yolodim v'Yolodos. We'd say in Yiddish or so, kleine Kinder, small children, probably they're below the age of bar mitzvah or bas mitzvah, who were captured by the Romans. Remember, we don't have to go into the detail of the brutality and the awesome power of Rome in dealing with their enemies who revolted against them, especially the war that they had with the Jewish people for several years, and even afterwards in other campaigns. So that's all there in the Talmudic literature, in history. We know all about that. So they captured these 400 children, and they were put on a ship. They were placed on a boat, obviously going back from the Eastern Mediterranean to Rome. That's where, what were they going to do with them? Most of the people, the grown-ups that they captured, were sold into slavery. That was part of the Roman technique, to scatter the people, sell them into slavery all over the existing Roman world in the slave markets. So here, these children, it says, Shenishbu l'kolon. They were captured for the purposes of shame. In other words, they were going to be used. Now we're talking about children, not talking about that was known in ancient times of the acts of violation of women, of rapine and everything else that went with it. Here we're talking about, we'd say, little kids. Yolodim v'yolodos, simple Ivrit, simple Hebrew, little boys and girls, and they knew, they gathered that what they were going to be used for. They were going to be used for immoral purposes. They were going, we'd say, this was a mass molestation of little girls and little boys. That's what they were going to be used for. And the Gemara describes very dramatically, it's a very dramatic scene. Try to imagine this here, all confined on this ship. Here, Gishu Biyatsu, they knew what they were going to be used for, the Mahei Mavakshi. And what happened? They said, they all said together, if we tovim biyam, if we sink, we drown in the sea, will we come to the future world? Because these children already had some idea that the concept of suicide, of doing away with oneself, is something which is deeply rooted against in Jewish law. A ma'abed atzmo l'das, person to take one's own life, is considered a terrible sin. It's discussed in various places in the Talmud based on biblical texts. So they knew that. So, but in our case, look what's our fate going to be. What are we going to do? So they asked a question. So it says there was an older from the boys, Hagodol Shebekulam, said, he quoted a verse in Tillim, which I won't go into the exact explanation of that for the purposes of time, but the verse in the book of Psalms, chapter 68, Psalm Ches, it mentions the fact when it says there where Hashem, the Almighty, says that I will come, I will return, take you from the mountains of Bashan, from the depths of the sea, and out of the teeth of fangs of the lion. And they said, it says, I will take you out of the depths of the sea. Those are those that drown themselves in the sea. I will save you, Hashem is saying, as if to say, you're not going to be committing a sin under these circumstances. So what happened was that the girls, the little girls, Kavan Sheshomu Yaloda, as soon as the girls heard this, Kafso Kulam, Venofel Sochayam. They all jumped into the sea. All the girls jumped in. They drowned themselves. Suicide, mass suicide of all of these little females. So then the boys said, now look, Nosel Kal V'chayma, this is something, what a lesson for us. These girls who will be molested by men, as if to say, well, that's male and female, or in a general conceptual sense, that's the way the world is, male with female. If there's relationships, that's the way the two genders are done, and it's, although it's in a way of abuse, but at least it's more natural. What might happen to us, we're the boys, we're going to be molested. We're going to be misused for all types of terrible purposes by them. We certainly should be able to find the future world. It won't be something that's a sin. So it says, so cool, and they all jumped into the sea. It's an awesome scene, and it says there later on that the verse is quoted on them, also another verse in Tehillim, that says, on account of you, that like the Jewish people are saying, it's a concept of martyrdom. We have been killed or being murdered all day, and we are considered like sheep to the slaughter. That's a pasuk there in 44th chapter of Tehillim. So this is a aspect of a suicide, but what has it brought about? What brings out this aspect? In fact, the Balei Tesros, the Rishonim, the early medieval commentators, both there in Gittin, on that page, on that daf, and also Masechta Avodah Zorah, where they talk about the question of under terrible pain or pressure of a person taking his or her own life in order to avoid torture, whatever it is, although it's a great sin to take one's life, but it is more or less substantiated by the statements under such circumstances, the agonizing aspect of being subject to this depredation, this terrible type of moral turpitude in action by powers on children and everything else, especially in that case, they are the ones that come to Olam Haba. So what is the emphasis out of this? Why am I telling, as if to say, this Maisa, this particular story? To show that a child, especially, that is molested and constantly being molested, sometimes the molester is someone known to that individual, someone that might be a teacher, it might be a relative, it might be someone in the community that deals with children, whoever it is, and if that person seems to be a most kindly individual, friendly individual, lures the child or whatever it is, but after a while, after being the subject of this person's lust or desires, or whichever way you'll describe it, the child, the victim, becomes in that state where they're willing to consider, how do I get out of this? They're afraid to speak to the parent, afraid to speak to other people. Maybe the only way is to get rid of myself. It might lead to potential suicide. That's what the Chazal say. If the child were to do it under those circumstances, it would be similar to that. It would not be a sin in his part. The sin would be on those who know about it and allow it. This somehow connects with something that happened here in Chicago years ago. If you remember years ago, more than, I can't say exactly how many, when our community became aware of a molestation problem, and there was a gathering, KJBS, in that congregation, and there was brought out from Nevada a author. I don't remember his last name. I think his first name was Jim. He was a teacher. He had a book, Not With My Child, which talks about molestation. And why did this ring a chord in my memory connecting with this suicidal action? Because what awakened him to this fact was, he was, I think, in the teaching profession. There was a wonderful teenager out there in one of the schools in Nevada that before his graduation, he had a great record, he committed suicide. Everybody wondered what happened. They investigated. He was being molested by a teacher for years, and now he couldn't take it anymore. He did away with himself, because this is what can happen to a molested child. So molestation is a serious, terrible, awesome matter which cannot be dismissed. Now, I can only speak from being in the rabbinate longer than anybody in this room, more than 50 years, 60 years after smicha. So you'll have to start calculating the age, and I don't mean any humor in that. But this, in the Jewish community, sometimes when this matter came to the fore, I'm not going to illustrate it, just what I've seen or what I've heard, when something like this happened, when someone is caught about molestation, well, it's a passing phase. That person who did it might be a respected member of the community. He's a well-respected, religious, pious individual, whatever it is. How can you expect it? It must have been some sort of a temporary aberration or so forth. And what about the victim? Oh, the kid will get over it. This I've heard repeated over and over again. I'm not telling you any Bubba Mice's grandmother stories. This is what has happened. And this gathering today should re-emphasize the growing awareness that we must take action to protect the most precious commodity or product of our community, the future of our community, our children, that we cannot allow children to be molested or be the objects of other people's lust or what desires or illness, whatever it is. So I think that today, when we talk about nefesh organization, pikuach nefesh is always used in the most extreme aspect of saving a life. But the word, if you translate pikuach, means to supervise, to take care of the soul. We have an obligation. And with that, I conclude. Our obligation and our deliberations today should bring together a great consciousness, a unity of supervising the nefesh, the souls, and the lives of our children. Hopefully that our efforts in this respect, when you hear from all of the professionals, their input and suggestions, that this will be most successful for pikuach nefesh. Thank you.